Bataan Death March. The Bataan Death March was a tragic event during World War II. About 75,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war were moved by force from Bataan to Camp O'Donnell by the Imperial Japanese Army. The transfer began on April 9, 1942, after a 3-month battle in the Philippines. The journey was 65 miles long, and many prisoners died due to severe physical abuse and wanton killings. The number of casualties varies widely in different sources, with some reporting up to 18,000 Filipino deaths and 650 American deaths. American soldiers who were caught on the ground or fell were instantly shot. After the war, the Japanese commander and 2 of his officers were tried for war crimes and sentenced to death for failing to prevent their subordinates from committing war crimes. The commander was executed in 1946, and the officers were executed in 1949. Today, the American soldiers who died or were killed during the march are remembered with gravestones honoring their sacrifice. During World War II, when General Douglas MacArthur returned to active duty, he rejected the most recent version of defensive plans for the Philippine Islands, which was known as WPO-3. While the plan was good from a military point of view, it was not realistic from a political point of view because it assumed a fight between only the United States and Japan and not all of the Axis powers. MacArthur recommended a more aggressive coastal defense strategy that included the entire archipelago, which was eventually approved. The task assigned to WPO-3 was to maintain control of the entrance to Manila Bay and prevent Japanese naval forces from using the harbor. If the adversary was victorious, the Americans were ordered to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, which was seen as the key to the control of Manila Bay, and defend it to the final extremity if they were defeated. However, the defenders failed to hold the Lingayen Gulf beaches, and MacArthur abandoned his plan and reverted to WPO-3. He evacuated President Manuel L. Quezon, High Commissioner Francis B. Sayre, their families, and his headquarters to Corregidor. On December 26, 1941, Manila was formally acknowledged as being open to the public, and on January 7, 1942, the Battle of Bataan started. The battle continued until April 9th, when the USAF commander surrendered to the 14th Japanese Army. Despite the tactical soundness of WPO-3, it was politically unrealistic and needed to account for the combined Axis powers, highlighting the importance of considering all potential threats in planning for war. When Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma and his staff found out they had almost twice as many prisoners as they had thought, they had a hard job. With over 60,000 starved, sick, and debilitated POWs and more than 38,000 similarly weakened civilian non-combatants caught up in the battle, the logistical challenge of transporting and moving such a large number of people was immense. Homma prioritized moving the prisoners and refugees to the north to keep them out of the way of his final assault on Corregidor. But there wasn't enough mechanized transport to move the huge number of hurt, sick, or weak people. In April 1942, after Bataan was surrendered to the Imperial Japanese Army, prisoners were ordered to turn over their possessions in the towns of Mariveles and Bagak. American Lieutenant Kermit Lay described how this was done and how some prisoners were executed for having Japanese souvenirs and money. The prisoners then started the march from Mariveles and Bagak, converging in Pilar, Bataan, and heading north to the San Fernando railhead. Initially, there were rare instances of kindness by Japanese officers and soldiers who spoke English, but this was quickly followed by brutality and theft. The first atrocity occurred when Filipino officers and NCOs were summarily executed in the Pantingan River Massacre under the supervision of Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, who had issued orders to execute all American captives. During the march, prisoners received little food or water, and many died due to severe physical abuse, including beatings and torture. The sun treatment was a typical torture in which detainees were made to sit in the searing direct sunshine without any form of protection for their heads, such as a helmet or any other head covering. Several who stumbled or gave up from exhaustion were run over by trucks, while cleanup crews executed those too weak to continue. Some marchers received random bayonet stabs or beatings. The prisoners were relocated to the north to keep them out of the path of Homa's last attack on Corregidor. Still, there needed to be more mechanized transport for the wounded, sick, and weakened masses, creating an enormous logistical challenge. After the fall of Bataan during World War II, the surviving prisoners were taken to Balanga, where they faced overcrowded conditions and poor hygiene, leading to the rapid spread of diseases like dysentery. The Japanese captors did not provide medical care to the prisoners, leaving U.S. medical personnel with limited supplies to tend to the sick and wounded. The prisoners were then crammed into unventilated metal boxcars for a 1-hour trip to Capas, enduring 43 degrees C, 110 degree F heat, with at least 100 prisoners in each car. Since no sanitary facilities were on board, the convicts suffered greatly from sickness. They were forced to walk the remaining 9 miles, 14 kilometers, from the Capas train station to Camp O'Donnell, where they perished at a rate of several hundred per day. The death toll of the march was estimated to be as high as 20,000 Americans and Filipinos, with most of the dead buried in mass graves behind the barbed wire surrounding the compound. During the march, there were an estimated 80,000 prisoners of war, POWs, but only 54,000 made it to Camp O'Donnell. Mariveles to San Fernando and Capas to Camp O'Donnell are each approximately 69.6 miles apart from Mariveles, making the total distance traveled during the march between 60 and 69.6 miles, 96.6 and 112.0 kilometers. The death march was later declared a Japanese war crime by an Allied military commission. The aftermath of the Bataan death march was devastating. Stanley L. Falk made the only serious attempt to estimate the number of deaths during the Bataan death march, according to some sources. Falk arrived at his estimate by subtracting the number of American and Filipino troops who escaped to Corregidor and remained in the hospital at Bataan from the number present at the start of April. He then made a conservative estimate of the number killed in the final days of fighting and those who fled into the jungle to avoid surrendering to the Japanese. Falk's calculation suggests 600 to 650 American deaths and 5,000 to 10,000 Filipino deaths during the march. However, other sources report deaths ranging from 5,000 to 18,000 Filipino to 500 to 650 American deaths. Some researchers believe the total death toll, including Filipino civilians who tried to help the marchers, is even higher. However, the United States eventually avenged its defeat in the Philippines with the invasion of the island of Leyte in October 1944. General Douglas MacArthur, who had promised to return to the Philippines, kept his word. After the end of World War II, General Masaharu Homa, who was responsible for the Bataan death march, was arrested and charged with war crimes. Although he claimed to be ignorant of the high death toll of the march, he was found guilty of permitting brutal atrocities and other high crimes committed by members of his command. Homa was sentenced to death by firing squad and executed in April 1946. Masanobu Tsuji, one of his subordinates, went to China to avoid British authorities. 2 other subordinates, Major General Yoshitaka Kawan and Colonel Kurataro Hirano, were also prosecuted and executed for their roles in the atrocities. These sad events remind us of how cruel and inhumanely people were treated during World War II and how important it is to hold people accountable for their actions.